Hello, everyone. Tom Fox with Brandon Daniels, President and CEO of Exiger. Brandon, first of all, it's great to have you back for another podcast series.
Tom, it's great to be back. It's good to see you.
So, Brandon, we are going to open our first podcast with, I don't want to say breaking news, but certainly some very bad news. And it really seems to set the stage for this entire podcast series. And that was the arrest of men's group employees in Beijing and now held incommunicado and in detention. What does that tell you about China's coming conflict and what's going to mean for the business person?
Yeah, again, thank you, Tom, for doing this podcast. I think it's an important moment in time for people in the compliance community, in the procurement community, in the acquisition community to be explicitly aware of what's happening to the safety, security, and ethics of our corporate ecosystem. When I look at what's going on with the Minsk group, the first thing is I can't comment on them. I don't know them. I know what's reported, but at the same time, we've seen this type of situation occur in the past where companies that are designed to provide transparency into Chinese markets, into Chinese companies, into potential corruption, into potential overlap or overreach of the Chinese government into industry that's impacting our global community, we've seen them be silenced before. And so what this is for me is this is a big red flag. This is potentially another attempt to increase the opacity of the Chinese market, right? And how much potential subversion of our global free market there is. I don't want to overstate what Exiger is to the world. But I would say that the market that we're in, this sort of like governance, risk, and compliance market that provides transparency to people, allows us to conduct business safely and to have independent views and due diligence is so important to our world order and to our ability to manage risk that to see something like this happen, it should be of global concern. And so I don't know the facts, but the fact that I do know is I want to know the facts. I want to know why these people are detained. I want to know, just like it would be in the free press, why an independent, objective company that is built to provide transparency and to uproot corruption is right now under siege. And I think we should all want to know, because if it's because they are exposing factual information, then everyone should be concerned about operating in China and what kind of safety and security you have in China.
It's not just operating in China, because at this point, I'm going to call Hong Kong still separate from China, even though the Chinese may have a different view of that. And
Yeah.
obviously, we have seen political changes in Hong Kong, mainland China taking a much firmer grip, moving against pro democracy and pro Hong Kong protesters. But from the business perspective, we've seen, in my mind, some troubling actions by the Chinese government, one of which was HSBC and JP Morgan were warned by the Chinese government not to do business with very prominent Hong Kong dissidents. So we've seen this in other areas. Is that something that Exiger or you are seeing in your conversations around these topics going?
Yeah. So we have three conversations that often overlap with this topic of sort of Chinese adversarial activity or attempts to subvert US and ally global intentions. One is with in our private public partnerships and our work with the federal government. We see that there is not just increasing geopolitical tension, but we see more intentionality in the actions of Beijing and almost more explicit, more brazen actions by Beijing to subvert our industrial base, to subvert our role in the global US economy. Very specific, very targeted investments in the critical technologies that we have, things like battery plants in Michigan getting stood up with Chinese investors, them buying up agriculture in the United States. You see some of the places where we source some of our most critical minerals like cobalt in the Congo or copper in South America. China specifically trying to control these resources. But the interesting thing is, with a more clear message of we want to own them and potentially disrupt them if the United States and China goals conflict, right? And in the instance of a conflict, to shut them off, to constrain them, to stop them, right? So in the federal government, I think people are aware of the fact that this isn't just an economic issue anymore. This is now down to like our national and economic security as a global community. The second area of communications that we're having is with corporate leadership and our customers. And the fact is, a fair and free market right now includes China. And even if we decouple, even if we have an east-west view, even if we have a reshoring of our manufacturing base, of our materials base, there are billion people in China. It's a big part of the of our global community. It's a manufacturing base that we still very much rely on. There are tariffs that have expired that make it cheaper for US companies to manufacture things in China than in Vietnam or Malaysia. And so we're seeing some companies retrench economic activity in China. And the real concern there is, can I ever win in a competitive battle with a Chinese company? Because not only am I relying on them from an economic and manufacturing perspective, right? Not only do we source from the same raw materials, but they're saying, but I don't have access to the economic policies that China puts in place, which are coercive, right? So we see in the US tooling industry, we see in the US battery markets, we see in many of the metals areas of the market that quite literally Chinese companies backed by SOEs, maybe even private companies that have investments by SOEs, stockpiling inventory at half the cost, at twice the volume than a US company could ever feasibly do, even if they're manufacturing in China. So you see them beating them on the shelf by 75% on price because there's economic coercion in the cost, right? And so we see corporate leaders that say this economic battle almost can't be won unless we expose and provide transparency to how the Chinese government is manipulating the economics of our market. And then finally, the third conversation I hear is with the NGOs that we support, right? The situation in Xinjiang, the situation with North Korean immigrants being forced into forced labor in the garment industry, like we saw with the CBP flags, the CBP sanctions on companies like Sunrise Garment a couple of months ago. We're seeing a coercion then bleed into human rights issues. And I think that's the third conversation that we're having that's so important. And as you see China, and either through making them vassal states or like they did in Hong Kong, where they took away the separation, the administrative separation between the two countries. Those places they're now avenues for China to conduct this kind of economic coercion. And it's sad. It's why we did a lot of work in the IPO market in Asia 3 years ago. But when China took over Hong Kong, we shut down those offices. And we shut down those offices because we thought it put our people in jeopardy. We thought it put our data in jeopardy. We thought it put our customers in jeopardy. And I think a lot of other companies are thinking twice about how this could impact them. The last thing I would say, Tom, is that China isn't just annexing and creating economic and legislative policy that undermines our visibility to the true economics of how China is operating, but also they are explicitly doing that. So there was the blocking statutes that they issued back in 2021 that had the immediate impact of essentially allowing all Chinese companies to intentionally subvert extraterritorial laws from the United States, right? And that set of statutes essentially means that if you're sourcing Uyghur forced labor and that's what you're utilizing, the finished products are coming from Uyghur forced labor, you potentially have the right to doctor the information going to the United States or route it through another shell company to try to stop the United States from hindering Chinese economic activity. And you would encouraged to do that according to these blocking statutes. And so that's that's another really alarming part of what's going on right now.
Brandon, the conversations with senior executives of U.S. public companies that you are having is, as we move towards the end of this episode, is there one or two key points that you're trying to communicate to them, whether it's to start looking, whether it's to do a risk assessment, or perhaps something else? What advice might you give to the senior executive at this point?
So there are two things. One, I am a big proponent of free markets, of capitalism, of democracy. And I don't love the idea of shutting out any country from the benefits of democracy. I want to operate in a scalable and free market. I can't say don't operate in a region. But the two things that I do say are one, when it comes to a bid from a Chinese company in any of your critical infrastructure, so that's logic bearing circuitry, right? Things that are finished products that are critical to the survival of your business, key pharmaceutical ingredients that you and your patients can't live without, you should think twice before taking the cheap bid, right? What we've seen in ZTE, what we saw in Huawei, in them intentionally subverting US economic sanctions, that was not an economic decision. That was a decision that was taken on the basis that they were willing to jeopardize the single largest telecommunications and microelectronics market in the world, the United States. They were willing to jeopardize it to penetrate one of the smallest telecommunications markets in the world, Iran. What does that say to you? It means that it's not about economics. It's not about the amount of money that they can get out of it. This isn't greed. This is subverting global democracy, right? And so don't just go with the cheap bid. Pay attention to the national security risk that a cheap bid from one of these Chinese companies could mean to your business, and think differently about how you establish security in critical products. The second thing I would say is you have to have diversity in your supply. Thinking of security as a premium. If you have the opportunity to support a Taiwanese company, to support a Korean company, to support a UK company, to support a US company in your supply base and in your manufacturing base, take that opportunity, right? There are 525,000 US manufacturing companies, Tom, right? And how many of them have visibility to the largest companies in the world? And how many of those companies have visibility to those 525,000 companies, right? The market integration is very little. And there are some efforts by companies like Onyx Marketplace, which has been working with the states and local municipalities to create better awareness of local manufacturing capabilities. Look into those opportunities. When you have something that gets disrupted, that's from a place where you have overdependence like China, look at an alternative source in places that are growing and thriving in those industries. Japan is putting a lot of money into their electronics sector. Korea is putting a lot of money into semiconductors. The United States is putting a lot of money into semiconductors. We've got great relationships growing with Mexico. Canada is actually a hub for artificial intelligence. We've got a global, let's start treating it that way. And let's allow for a little bit of a premium to come with diversity, security, and redundancy in our commerce.
Brandon, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but I hope our listeners will join us next time where we take a look at some specific supply chain issues. I look forward to continuing this conversation.